Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series. This video has been a long time coming. This is a piece of history that has captivated me for years, and honestly it's one that I've put off for so long because I feel like there's always more to learn when it comes to this topic. I'm constantly discovering new things I never knew before, but I think it's about time that I finally talk about the 80s AIDS crisis. There's so much I could cover in this video and I'm not going to be able to cover everything, it's just not possible. So consider this an in-depth summarisation of what happened, I suppose. This is a topic I feel really passionately about, and it's a story that I feel like everyone should know. Most people who lived through the 80s will likely know the basics of this or know the full story, but I often find that when I mention the AIDS crisis to people my age and younger, I get met with blank stares. This is a part of history that changed the entire world. And yes, this video is going to get political. Everything is political. But the AIDS crisis is steeped in politics. And as I always say at the beginning of any video where I cover the LGBTQ+ community, if you are rude in the comments, you will get blocked and your comment will be deleted without a second thought. There is no room on this channel for homophobia and bigotry, and if you do feel inclined to be rude, then maybe just watch the entire video. You might learn something new. I strongly believe that education is the key to getting rid of prejudice. And of course, this video is sponsored by Magellan TV. As you probably know by this point, we have an ongoing sponsorship, and I know that so many of you have already signed up to Magellan. So today I'd like to make my documentary recommendations first. Today I'm going to recommend that you watch Confessions of an Alien Abductee. I think the title is pretty self-explanatory here, but this film follows some people who believe that they've been abducted before or they have a connection with aliens. I'm personally fascinated by the idea of aliens, and it's really easy just to laugh at these kinds of people, but this documentary is super interesting and it makes some very valid and interesting points. And the next recommendation is very apt for my channel. I talk a lot in my serial killer series about brain damage and how it potentially affects people's personalities and behaviour. And Magellan have a documentary called Brain Damage: The Truth About Trauma, and it looks into just that. It tells a story of brain injury survivors whilst looking at the science behind it. I was so thrilled when I came across this documentary, and I know you'll all love it as much as I did. It really backs up a lot of what I talk about in my videos about brain injury and sort of changes in personality and behaviour. For those of you who haven't signed up yet, Magellan TV is a streaming service dedicated purely to documentaries. I advocate education and bettering yourself and your knowledge at every single opportunity, so I really cannot recommend Magellan TV enough. They have everything from true crime, science, history, nature, and everything in between. There's something for everyone. And there's new programmes added weekly that can be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K. Definitely check Magellan TV out if you love documentaries as much as I do. I want to start this video with a direct quote from an incredible book that I've read on this topic, And the Band Played On by Randy Shilts. If you want a really deep dive into the AIDS epidemic, I would highly recommend this book. I mean, look how huge this is. This video is going to be able to cover the main parts of the epidemic, but at the end of the day, I'm barely going to be able to scratch the surface of everything that went on throughout this and everything that's in this book. Randy writes in the introduction here, "The bitter truth was that AIDS did not just happen to America. It was allowed to happen by an array of institutions, all of which failed to perform their appropriate tasks to safeguard the public health. This failure of the system leaves a legacy of unnecessary suffering that will haunt the Western world for decades to come." I couldn't word it better than that myself. Whilst we're going to focus on the AIDS epidemic in America in the 80s, the only place to start our story is in Congo, Africa, with a bit of epidemiology. Whilst it doesn't seem like scientists can be 100% sure of the origins of the disease, the agreed consensus is that the virus crossed from chimps to humans in the 1920s in what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. Chimps carried SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, and they lived in close proximity to humans who hunted and ate them. It probably transferred to humans as a result of undercooked meat or through chimp blood getting into human cuts or wounds. Normally the hunter would be able to fight off SIV, but on a few occasions the virus adapted itself to the new host and became known as HIV-1, the human immunodeficiency virus. There is another strain as well, HIV-2, which is far rarer and less infectious than type 1. And it comes from a different breed of monkey, although the crossover to humans probably happened in a very similar way. HIV-2 is mainly found in a few countries in West Africa. HIV-1 caused a pandemic. The first verifiable case of HIV is from a blood sample taken in 1959 from a man living in Congo, analysed years later, and HIV was found. Although there's proof that people had the virus before then, this is the first confirmed case. So HIV/AIDS was happening way before the 1980s in the USA. But it was 1980/1981 when a few cases of rare diseases began being reported among gay men in California and New York. Rare cancers like Kaposi sarcoma and PSP, which is pneumocystitis carinii pneumonia. No one knew what was the cause of these illnesses, but by the end of the year there were reports of 270-ish people suffering some very similar illnesses. These are really rare illnesses, and all of a sudden you've got gay men across the country suffering from them. No one knew what the cause was, but by the end of the year there were reports of 270 people suffering these very similar illnesses, almost all of which only ever usually affected people with already compromised immune systems. We now know this was HIV, but at the time they had no idea what was going on. But how did HIV arrive in the USA in the first place? For many years, the fault was falsely placed on one man, one of the most demonised medical patients in history, and it's all because of a misunderstanding. Gaetan Dugas was a flight attendant travelling the world with his job, and he came into contact with more people, more cultures than most ever would. He was from Quebec in Canada, and he was in his late 20s when this began to start. And he was accused of being Patient Zero, the man who brought HIV to America. He was a flight attendant in and out of America's major cities constantly, and he alone was accused for many years of planting HIV, without knowledge of course, in these major cities across the USA. He was a beautiful man, openly gay, living his best life in the aftermath of the sexual revolution. But in 1980, he was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, a rare skin cancer that would leave purpley spots on the skin of sufferers. This was one of the many illnesses that would become the mark of HIV. In 1982, Gaetan was undergoing chemotherapy for cancer when he was interviewed by the CDC, the US Centre for Disease Control and Prevention. They asked him questions about his sexual activity, the CDC at this point making the connection between HIV/AIDS and sexual activity. Gaetan estimated that he'd had some 750 partners in the previous few years, and he gave the CDC a list of contacts from his address book. Gaetan becomes patient 57 to the CDC, and in 1984, the same month that he sadly died of AIDS, the report is published, with patient 57 being renamed Patient O, intended to stand for out of California. But at some point people began misreading O as zero, Patient Zero, the apparent first one, which was further confused by Gaetan being referred to as the original patient, which simply meant to refer to him as being the original patient of this study. They used the contacts, the names he'd given them, to create a kind of spider diagram showing the potential effect on patients across the country. And of course these people could have gotten HIV from any sexual contact, not specifically from Gaetan. There's no way of knowing. The CDC attempted to do damage control to say that he wasn't the original patient, but it was too late. The media had got hold of the story and spun it out of control, making Gaetan the scapegoat for this terrifying illness that was sweeping the country. In 2016, it was proven once and for all that Gaetan Dugas did not bring HIV/AIDS to America. It had been in the country way before he ever had been. But from now on, when you hear the term Patient Zero, you know what the history is, you know where that came from. By around 1981-82, scientists had begun to connect the dots. All these men suddenly dying of very similar diseases. But HIV/AIDS didn't even have a name yet. All they could see were some very similar symptoms cropping up across the country, focused mainly in California and New York. Before we go into detail, I think we need to talk a little about how HIV/AIDS works. I'm going to keep this simple so I don't confuse anyone, but as I said, HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. Most people infected with HIV will experience a short flu-like illness about 2 to 6 weeks after infection. Nothing awful, most people just feel a little bit run down as if they've got a cold or something similar. This is your immune system putting up a fight against this new virus that's infecting the body. It's also fairly common to get a rash during this same time period. But then these symptoms will disappear and you'll likely not have any further symptoms for years. That's right, years. And during this time when people feel perfectly healthy, they've got no symptoms of any illness, HIV is still infectious. It's part of the reason why it spread as viciously as it did. This time is called the clinical latency stage, but the virus is far from dormant. It wreaks havoc on the body, causing progressive damage to your immune system. HIV attacks CD4 cells, which are a subtype of T cell. T cells actively help your body fight off infections, and as HIV progresses in the body, T cell counts lower, and the body becomes more susceptible to picking up illnesses and infections. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome and is the late stage of HIV infection. The illness is considered to have transitioned into full-blown AIDS when the number of T cells falls below 200 cells per cubic milliliter of blood. In a healthy person, you're looking at between 500 and 1,600 cells. Or HIV can also be considered AIDS once a person has begun to develop opportunistic infections, regardless of their cell count. The most common opportunistic infections include herpes, salmonella, thrush, toxoplasmosis, and there are so many more as well. The body simply gets to a point where it can no longer fight off even the simplest of infections, and eventually it kills you. If untreated, of course. I read a quote which seemed quite honest. You don't die from AIDS, you die from another illness that your immune system simply can't fight off because of the AIDS. For many years, HIV was a death sentence. If you caught it, you were going to die, simple as. Nowadays, that's not so much the case. Advances in the medical field means that HIV is no longer the death sentence that it used to be. But imagine a time in the early 80s where you got people dying left, right and centre, and the terms HIV and AIDS simply don't exist. In June 1981, an unusual occurrence was reported in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a publication led by the CDC. 5 people in Los Angeles had contracted PCP and 2 of these had died. This was the first published incident of this unrecognised deadly disease. It was noted that all of the victims were men who had sex with men and they all showed abnormally low T cell counts. A second report in the July of 1981 documented 26 patients, all gay men again, all suffering from PCP or Kaposi sarcoma. As the next couple of years progressed, it became clear that this was a pandemic. More and more men were appearing in hospitals with very similar symptoms, and they had no name to give it. The name GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, was first mentioned in a New York Times article in May 1982, although it was never actually used in scientific literature. It was believed that this fatal disease only affected gay men and that this disease was a punishment from God, that people get what they deserve in life. GRID was the punishment for these immoral acts. But it soon became clear that not only gay men were being affected by this so-called gay plague. It began popping up in other groups, haemophiliacs and apparently Haitian people. News came out that the HIV virus had been identified in a Haitian man in Miami as early as the 60s. In 1983, the CDC infamously described the 4 risk factors for AIDS as the 4H group: homosexuals, heroin users, haemophiliacs and Haitians. And this was dangerous for a multitude of reasons. I mean, for one, there's the huge levels of racism that began to be shown against Haitian people. People got fired from their jobs, people refused to be anywhere near them. I mean, we're talking the 80s here, homophobia and racism were already pretty prevalent, although it's getting better. And then you've got this disease that apparently is only affecting these types of people, and it just gets worse. But also, by narrowing the victims of this disease to just these 4 groups meant that the rest of the population wrongly assumed that they would remain unaffected, which couldn't be further from the truth. Anyone is susceptible. The widespread use of the term AIDS began around autumn 1982 after the CDC used it for the first time. AIDS referred to the symptoms and immune deficiency, but they still had no idea what caused this so-called AIDS. But the answer would come in 1983. Luc Montagnier was a French virologist and a long-time researcher at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, and he'd been asked for assistance in finding the cause of a mysterious new syndrome, AIDS, which of course had spread across the Atlantic to Europe. It wasn't only confined to the USA, this was a worldwide pandemic. Montagnier and his team took a look at samples taken from a patient with the early symptoms of AIDS, which was then called pre-AIDS, and they isolated a retrovirus from the sample and found that they were able to infect T cells from a healthy donor, but they weren't able to infect other cell types. They had isolated what is now known as HIV, but they named it lymphadenopathy associated virus, or LAV. They knew they'd clearly isolated something, but they weren't clear on the fact that this was the cause of AIDS. And on the 20th of May 1983, their findings were published in the journal Science. Only people didn't really pay attention to this. And then an American biomedical researcher named Robert Gallo and his team isolate a retrovirus that they called HTLV3, Human T-cell leukemia virus 3, and they start looking into this virus's possible involvement in AIDS. They isolate this virus in 48 patients with AIDS and pre-AIDS, but in none of 150 heterosexual individuals with no known risk of AIDS. And they also published this discovery in Science in May 1984, a year after the French paper was published. I'm making a very long and sciencey story as short as I possibly can here. There's a lot more to it than I'm choosing to share, but for your basic understanding, basically the French and American teams had isolated the very same virus, which, as you can imagine, caused a lot of arguments in the scientific community. They both wanted credit for discovering this virus, and they both had to be fair. Gallo argued that they were the ones who demonstrated that the virus caused AIDS, whilst Montagnier's group pointed out that their paper said that the virus's role in AIDS remained to be determined, so they'd also sort of figured it out. I think it was 1986 when the two viruses, LAV and HTLV3, were confirmed to be the same for definite. And at that point it was renamed Human Immunodeficiency Virus, HIV. Controversially, it was actually the French team who received recognition for the discovery of HIV with the 2008 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. But the two scientists now openly recognise that each of them made significant, important discoveries here. But that's enough sciencey stuff for now. Let's talk about the sociology around it. Let's talk about why HIV spread so quickly and why it was so focused within the gay community. In terms of a sexually transmitted disease, the 70s/80s was probably the worst time for it to hit. America at this time is in the midst of a sexual revolution. Behaviour around sexuality and relationships was changing. Casual sex outside the traditional monogamous relationships was becoming more accepted, and sex was spoken about in a way that it never had been before, in terms of both hetero and homosexuality. It became normal-ish to have more than one sexual partner. And the 80s came a decade after the Stonewall riots, which changed the attitudes of LGBTQ+ people nationwide. Pre-Stonewall, people would be more likely to hide their homosexuality. People were more likely to act straight, get married to the opposite sex and live a life in the closet. Post-Stonewall, people were more likely to embrace their sexuality. People were out and proud. There were the annual parades and celebrations, huge gatherings of LGBT people, and people began to have more sex. Promiscuity became something not to be ashamed of. In a huge generalisation here, polygamy and promiscuity was the standard in the gay community at the time. Monogamy between gay couples, particularly gay men, was on the rarer end of the spectrum. You see, in this time it was one thing to be gay. It was a whole other thing to be in a committed gay relationship. It was almost too good to be true, as if the gay community had compartmentalised sex and love into two very different categories. So promiscuity was kind of the norm. There are plenty of myths and misconceptions over how one can get HIV, but it can only be passed from one person to another via blood, semen, vaginal fluid, anal mucus and breast milk. You cannot get HIV from kissing, toilet seats, sharing food, sneezing and coughing, sweat or anything like that. But it just so happens that HIV does happen to be incredibly easily spread via anal sex. An article from 2010 that I read on thebodypro.com states that the HIV transmission risk during a single act of unprotected receptive anal sex may be 18 times higher than unprotected receptive vaginal sex. And those numbers stand for both males and females receiving anal sex. This is because the lining of the rectum is much thinner and allows HIV to enter the bloodstream a lot easier. And the gay community, of course, largely didn't use protection. With zero education on gay sex, there was little knowledge of sexually transmitted disease as a whole, and zero risk of pregnancy. So why would they need to use condoms? Due to a lack of monogamy in the gay community, these infections would spread like wildfire. One single person could infect multiple people who would go on to infect multiple more, and so on. Liberal cities such as San Francisco and New York in particular saw the spreading of HIV quicker than anyone even knew it was happening. And because the effects of HIV/AIDS don't really begin to show for a number of years, so many people got infected with HIV before the name was even a whisper. And HIV spread quicker in the USA than in Europe, for example, simply because they were ahead of Europe in terms of homosexuality. There were more bathhouses, more gay bars, more clubs. People were more comfortable in certain areas of the country, being out and proud. This leads to more sex, which leads to more infection. And also there's much higher intravenous drug use in the USA, which, as we know, was/is another leading cause of AIDS. For example, in 1985, when Germany started reporting deaths from AIDS, the number was at 170 deaths. By that point in the USA, in 1985, almost 7,000 people had died. Yes, the USA is a much bigger country with a much bigger population, but the numbers definitely aren't relative there. And you can imagine the stigma that comes along with a disease like HIV/AIDS. This is an illness that was commonly referred to as the gay plague, a view that was actually egged on by the media. There was already this stigma around homosexuality, and although a lot of the community had made the collective decision to actively fight the stigma in the aftermath of Stonewall, things took a huge step back when this disease suddenly appeared, which seemed to only affect gay people. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the most religious of America took it as a direct punishment from God. God was punishing the community for its immoral behaviour. And this stood as well when it became known that intravenous drug addicts were also an at-risk group. They were also considered to be immoral. And of course, this stance backfired when apparent innocent people began to suffer as well. Mothers can pass HIV to their babies in uteros. They can pass it down through breastfeeding. Haemophiliacs can get it through blood transfusions. Straight women and men could get it through sex. Poor or rich, black or white, old or young, HIV does not discriminate. In general, a fear of the unknown can cause people to panic. Humans feel the need to know the answers to everything, and for years there was no answer to HIV. This panic puts up an instant wall between the people suffering, the at-risk communities, and the general public. I mean, a perfect example of this right now is the coronavirus and the racism and fear that we're already seeing displayed towards Chinese people. This is a reference that will probably be outdated if you're watching this in a year or so's time, I'm sure, or at least I hope it is. Humanity never learns. It repeats the same mistakes over and over again. And even today, HIV/AIDS is still very stigmatised, especially by the older people who lived through the 80s. Back in the 80s, being sick with AIDS was only half the issue. The illness came along with being ostracised from society, discriminated against and rejected by almost everyone around you. Most people were fired from their jobs if their HIV status was made public. No job equals no money equals how are they going to pay their medical bills? People were terrified of catching HIV themselves, and therefore they would altogether avoid anyone with the illness. And the public assumed that homosexuality meant you must have AIDS. If you were gay, you had it. So once again, these people were shoved to the outskirts of society after a decade of fighting to be accepted. And research has shown that men who have sex with men may exhibit less health-seeking behaviour and have greater levels of depression, anxiety and substance misuse because of this stigma they face. So gay men would be less likely to visit the doctor and get diagnosed, less likely to take steps to care for their health, leading to a higher rate of spreading disease. And they just get to a point where they don't care anymore, meaning that they're more likely to turn to drugs. Intravenous drugs, as we know, is another high risk factor when it comes to catching HIV. Stigma around the gay community and HIV was, / still is, literally deadly. This stigma meant that more people got ill. Misinformation spread through the media, with people believing they could be infected just by skin-to-skin contact with an affected person. But it was in 1991 that Princess Diana actually completely broke barriers when she was seen shaking hands with a person suffering from AIDS without gloves. It just wasn't the done thing. You didn't touch people with AIDS. She opened the UK's first purpose-built HIV/AIDS unit at London Middlesex Hospital. And in that moment of shaking a sufferer's hand sans gloves, she made a statement to the rest of the world. And it was small things like that, people making small differences, that slowly began to change the way the world viewed AIDS. But it took a long time. So you're in this world where these gay men are being completely ostracised from society. Like, they are considered to be the devil. They've been given this immoral disease by God. So who was there to help them? The lesbian community's impact on the AIDS crisis was well documented. The LGBTQ+ community hasn't always been as cohesive as it is today. And throughout even the fight in the 1970s, there was a fairly large divide between gay men and lesbians. Even within the community, there were the standard gender stereotypes and roles, and many lesbians generally felt like gay men were still chauvinistic and still just men. That's a generalisation, of course, but that's kind of just to illustrate the divide that was felt there. It wasn't a close friendship between the two sides of the community. But then the 80s started and the AIDS epidemic hit, and gay men were ostracised more than they had been in years. And in that moment, the community kind of realised that they were one, fighting the very same battle. Most of the population became terrified of catching this disease, and as you probably realised, they were quite unwilling to help. Gay men were dying in their hordes, their numbers were completely decimated. The whole community was dealing with trauma and grief. And it was the lesbian community who banded together to support. The hospitals were full of lesbians volunteering their time, volunteering to go to the rooms of AIDS patients and talk to them, feed them, touch them. They were some of the only people willing to treat these men as human. A huge number of these men had been rejected, cast away by their families, and their chosen families, the other men in the gay community, were just as ill, many dying in their own hospital beds. AIDS was a lonely, lonely illness, and lesbian women provided the kindness when nobody else would. And lesbians were one of the lowest risk groups for catching HIV, so there were still all these women who just wanted to help. In 1983, men who have sex with men were banned from giving blood across America in an effort to prevent HIV from being spread through blood transfusions. European countries soon followed, and men who have sex with men are still banned or restricted from donating blood in a huge amount of countries to this very day. But this ban led to blood reserves across the country severely depleting. But HIV sufferers desperately needed blood to fight the disease, so it was a catch-22 situation. And lesbian blood drives become a thing. Bands of lesbian women come together to donate blood specifically to their brothers suffering with AIDS. The first drive happened on the 16th of July 1983. 200 women turn up. Within weeks, similar blood drives were popping up around the whole country, and this continued throughout the whole of the 80s and 90s. Many gay men who survived the epidemic say they were saved physically and mentally by the lesbian community. But the question is, where were the rest of the country at this time? What were they doing to help? Well, not really much. Of course, you had the scientific and medical communities working double time to try and fight this disease, and their contributions cannot go unnoticed, but everyone else was kind of just hoping it would go away. Homosexuality was such a taboo that people didn't even want to think about homosexuals existing, let alone help them out. The way in which the media reported on AIDS was absolutely horrific, and at the end of the day, the media has a huge say in how the public responds to any crisis, any moment in history. I mean, to start off with, the media referred to AIDS as the gay disease for the first couple of years, leading a lot of people to incorrectly think that it could only affect gay men. Then it was reported that drug users could get it. Then, oh look, black Haitian men have also got it. And it led to a lot of people, see, straight white people, to feel wrongly invincible. But whilst the media fed on publicising those immoral humans who died from the illness, they didn't actually inform anyone of any preventative measures they could take. The stories were mostly sensationalist. Look what's happening to these people, but don't worry, it won't happen to you. The media seriously underrepresented the seriousness of this illness, how quickly it spread. And you can't talk about sex, let alone gay sex, on a national news level. The media didn't tell men to wear condoms to help prevent spreading of the disease. They didn't say that anyone was at risk. Promiscuity and homosexuality, two things that the conservative media definitely did not want to be seen as promoting. And it wasn't until Hollywood actor Rock Hudson announced that he was HIV positive did the media suddenly proclaim that now no one is free from AIDS. This was the headline splashed across the cover of Life magazine in 1985. Since 1981, the media has been saying, don't worry, this is only a thing that gay men get, you only get it if you're immoral. And then suddenly 1985 hits and it's anyone can get it now, but it's too late. People have already got it. According to the media, Rock Hudson was a straight, non-drug using man, although it is very well acknowledged now that Rock Hudson was definitely gay. The media at the time hadn't quite caught on to that, but it was known within circles that Rock Hudson was definitely gay. Suddenly the disease was tragic, heartbreaking, one of their own had died. AIDS had been ravaging gay men in California and New York for years, but it's only now they cared. As a result of the AIDS crisis, there was a huge amount of anti-gay activism that started to pop up around the country. But since Stonewall, roughly 24 states had decriminalised sodomy by 1980. There had been these huge steps forwards in gay acceptance, the gay community in the years since Stonewall, and then suddenly the AIDS crisis hits and it's just 10 steps backwards. In the 70s, people were already talking about the possibility of homosexual marriage, which was the obvious next step in gay rights, and there was a huge backlash to this, mostly headed by religious figures, the moral majority. Oxford Dictionaries defines moral majority as the majority of people regarded as favouring firm moral standards. It was a prominent American political organisation which sought to mobilise conservative Americans to become politically active on issues that they thought were important. And of course the most important of these issues was the fight against homosexuality. They had to save their children from the immoral gays. And as the AIDS crisis grew, so did the moral majority, feeling that God was backing them up on their views here. And it's because of this moral majority that the people fighting AIDS, the activists, found their cries for attention, for help fighting this disease, were completely ignored by the people who could help, the higher ups in society, the president. And who was the president of the United States during this time, I hear you ask? Who was allowing all of this to happen in his country whilst remaining completely silent? Well, the answer is, of course, none other than moral majority ally, Ronald Reagan. If you're a fan of Reagan, if there can even be such a thing, then look away now because this is not going to be pretty. He was the president between 1981 and 1989, so he pretty much oversaw the entire crisis, beginning to kind of end, at least a slowing down of the crisis. And the Reagan administration has a lot to account for here. We already know that the scientific community first became aware of AIDS in 1981. By 1982, the CDC were researching it. By 83, 84, the HIV virus had been discovered. 3 years into the epidemic, there had been over 7,000 reported cases of AIDS, thousands of yet undiscovered cases of HIV, and over 5,500 deaths. Yet Reagan didn't utter a word until 1985. But he and his administration were very much aware of what was going on. They chose not to say anything publicly. Was it a case that they didn't care that gay men were dying in hordes across the country? Or were they simply ashamed to talk about matters of homosexuality in public? Why would Reagan publicly speak out about AIDS, this gay disease that is ravaging his country, and piss off the moral majority, the people who voted him into power because of his conservatism? A reporter called Lester Consolving had been publicly asking questions about AIDS since 1982, raising the question repeatedly as a White House correspondent to Larry Speakes, who was the acting White House press secretary at the time. His questions are rebuffed time and time again. The first time he brings it up in 1982, Lester asks, "Does the president have any reaction to the announcement by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta that AIDS is now an epidemic in over 600 cases?" Larry, the White House speaker, replies, "AIDS? I haven't got anything on it." To which Lester replies, "Over a third of them have died. It's known as the gay plague." No, it is. It's a pretty serious thing. 1 in every 3 people that get this have died, and I wonder if the president was aware of this. As he's talking, the press pool is laughing, and Larry Speaks' only reply is, "Well, I don't have it. Do you?" Obviously implicating that he's gay. And there's another very well-known press briefing that took place on December 11th, 1984, 2 years later, in which Lester is determined to get an answer. What is the president going to do about AIDS? Lester moves to the front and begins his question, talking about the CDC's estimate that 300,000 people had been exposed to AIDS. Lester asks, will the president, as commander-in-chief, take steps to protect armed forces food and medical services from AIDS patients or those who run the risk of spreading AIDS in the same manner that they forbid typhoid fever people from being involved in the health or food services? I mean, the question's a little bit iffy. He's basically asking, like, are you going to stop people with AIDS working in the food and health services? It's questionable, but at least he's asking, he's talking about AIDS when most people are ignoring it. As he's speaking, the entire press room is laughing and cajoling him. Not much has changed in the previous 2 years. Lester asks if the president is concerned about the subject, to which Larry replies, "I haven't heard him express concern." They go back and forth, Lester pressing to find out if the president has expressed anything, any opinion about the disease at all. Larry laughs and replies, "Have you been checked?" These exchanges are hugely revealing. It shows how Reagan and his administration refused to take this seriously, and due to their delay, their refusal to take any public action, thousands upon thousands of people died. Also, don't make the mistake of thinking that this made Lester Kinsella being a particularly great person either, because he was actually incredibly outspoken against gay rights organisations. He was very multi-layered, as was Ronald Reagan. Amazingly, it actually seems in his private life that Ronald Reagan wasn't hugely homophobic. I mean, he was definitely homophobic. He was incredibly religious and conservative and spoke many times publicly about how society couldn't condone civil rights for the LGBT community. But privately, people say that he actually wasn't the sort of person who bothered about what people do in their own bedrooms. Not that it really matters what he privately thinks when he's preaching homophobia on a public platform, but Ronald Reagan had gay friends, Rock Hudson being one of them, and he was very open about the fact that he knew Rock Hudson was gay. He was the first person to openly invite a gay couple to spend the night at the White House. He was closeted about his tolerance of homosexuality. He just couldn't be seen condoning it in public. And don't get it wrong, tolerance does not equal acceptance here. He first spoke about AIDS kinda publicly just 2 weeks before Rock passed away from the disease. On September 17th, 1985, he first mentioned AIDS in a passing response to a question at a press conference. Then the next year, February 1986, he mentioned it again when he made a surprise visit to the Department of Health and Human Services, where he said, "One of our highest public priorities is going to be continuing to find a cure for AIDS." He didn't address it completely publicly in a dedicated speech though until 1987. He says in his 1987 speech that the government has made AIDS public enemy number 1 and says that they're determined to find a cure. Federal spending on AIDS rises from $8 million in 1981 to $416 million in 87. But around the same time, Reagan also said that school children should be taught abstinence and that children are no longer taught values, the obvious implication of which being that gay people don't have values. It's interesting that even at this point, years into the epidemic, the attention is being put on their conservative view of morality instead of actual prevention and education. He didn't mention AIDS until it was impossible for him to ignore any longer, and Reagan's silence for so long essentially allowed the HIV/AIDS crisis to grow from about 40 cases in 1981 to approximately 35 to 40 million today. Imagine how different the world would be today if the virus had been contained, understood, prevented earlier. 3 years later, on April 8th, 1990, a boy named Ryan White dies. Just days after his death, Ronald Reagan, who is no longer president at this point, says, We owe it to Ryan to make sure the fear and ignorance that chased him from his home and his school will be eliminated. We owe it to Ryan to open our hearts and our minds to those with AIDS. We owe it to Ryan to be compassionate, caring and tolerant towards those with AIDS, their friends and their families. It's the disease that's frightening, not the people who have it. So what had changed in those 3 years? Or more like, what was different about Ryan's story? Why did he deserve comment while so many others didn't? Well, Ryan White was a white, straight, teenage boy from Indiana. His story was huge in the 80s. He became the national face for HIV/AIDS in the USA after he was diagnosed following an infected blood transfusion that he received as treatment for his haemophilia. Ryan's story changed the public perception of the disease, which was always perceived as being caused by immoral behaviour. Now, an innocent child had it. Although Ryan always actually publicly rejected being called an innocent victim of AIDS, as he often was, him and his family have said that the phrase implied that the gay men with the disease were guilty of something. Ryan always said, "I'm just like everyone else with AIDS, no matter how I got it." And because of this, the gay community really rallied around him. The people living in New York always ensured that Ryan and his family were informed of the latest news and treatments as quickly as possible. News would have taken a while to travel to Indiana under the usual circumstances, and the media weren't talking about the latest in AIDS, were they? But Ryan's story was still not without its hardships. When he was diagnosed in December 1984, he was told that he had 6 months to live, but he wanted to return to school. Whilst people in the medical field know that this was not an airborne disease and Ryan posed no risk whatsoever to the other students, the disease was poorly understood by the general public, and he faced a huge stigma and huge backlash. When he tried to return to school, many parents and teachers literally held protests against it, worrying about other children catching it. Eventually, the principal and the school board succumbed to the pressure and told Ryan that he was not allowed to return to school, and a lengthy legal battle ensued. Eventually, it was ruled that he must be allowed to attend school, only for the other parents to drag their kids out of school. So the White family make the decision to move out of the community to Hamilton Heights High School in Arcadia, Indiana. Ryan begins his new high school in August 1987, and the principal and the students greet him with a smile and a shake of his hand. An AIDS expert had been called into the school to talk to the student body and faculty about the disease, and it taught them that there were no risks of Ryan being at the school. Education is so important, and this just proves it. These people at Ryan's new school weren't scared of him because they had been educated. But if Ryan White, this straight, white teenage boy, could face this much backlash after his diagnosis, imagine just how awful it was for the LGBT community, particularly the black LGBT community who were being diagnosed at a disproportionate rate. Ryan's plight catapulted him into the national spotlight. Whilst most newspapers didn't want to talk about the gay people suffering with AIDS, they could just about stomach a straight, white teenage boy. Ryan advocated for education and participated in numerous benefits to raise funds. Celebrities across America pledged to help him, and more celebrities began to publicly speak out against HIV/AIDS. Ryan ended up living much longer than the 6-month life expectancy he was given, living for 5 years. By early 1990 though, his health was deteriorating rapidly, and his last ever public appearance just happened to be him hosting an after-Oscars party with Ronald and Nancy Reagan in California. Just months after Ryan's death, Congress enacted the Ryan White Care Act, which stood for Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act. It's the USA's largest federally funded programme for people living with HIV/AIDS, and it's still in action to this very day, improving availability to care for low-income, under and uninsured victims of AIDS and their families. But whilst people listened to Ryan, he wasn't the only one advocating for better education and more funding into HIV/AIDS research. As early as 1982, gay organisations began to pop up across the country to raise awareness. Seeing as the government and media weren't being much help, the responsibility pretty much fell onto the LGBT community to help save themselves. Activist groups began distributing information about safe sex. They gave out condoms, there were needle exchange programs organised. I've already mentioned the lesbian groups for blood drives and care. These organisations knew what the community needed from the inside out. They knew the issues surrounding housing. Landlords refused to rent to those with HIV/AIDS. They knew the issues with medical bills, employment. Even small things like memorialising the dead became the work of the activists. If the LGBT community wanted things done, they had to do it themselves. The named Project Memorial Quilt was conceived in 1985 by AIDS activist Cleve Jones. He and a friend wanted a way to memorialise the people they knew who had died from AIDS, and he had the idea of a quilt, each panel the name of somebody lost to the disease. It began with a list of 40 men they knew who had died. I mean, even the idea of knowing 40 people who have died from this same disease is unimaginable. That really sort of drills in how serious this was, how many people were dying. For a while, activists have been working to organise a mass march for lesbian and gay rights to be held in Washington DC in October 1987. And Cleve had an aim to unfold this quilt on the mall at the march. But they begin small. They hang the first few panels from Mayor Dianne Feinstein's balcony at City Hall on the annual Gay Freedom Day in San Francisco. 200,000 people attended the celebration, which was dedicated to the memory of people who had died from AIDS, and everyone could see this quilt hanging from the balcony of the mayor. There was an information booth giving out brochures with instructions on how people could create their own panels for the quilt, memorialising their loved ones. And so people began to create their own panels for the quilt and send them in. By the time the quilt was unfolded at the march in Washington, it had 1,920 panels. It was huge, but it was just a small fraction of people who had died. Every single name on this quilt was read out loud as people just stood and listened and cried. Photos of the quilt appeared in the media and new panels arrived by the day from all around the world. In 1988, they began touring the quilt around the country, visiting 20 major cities in 4 months. At each stop, people, mostly mothers, would line up and present them with new panels that they'd sewn for their children. In a year, it grew to 8,000 panels. Now, the quilt continues to grow, consisting of more than 48,000 memorial panels and weighs an estimated 54 tonnes. The goal was to bring awareness to AIDS, to provide a visual understanding of how many people this disease tore away. This year, the quilt is actually going to return to San Francisco for good, which is where the project originally began. So we're in the mid to late 80s. We've got this virus that is ravaging the country, and there really is nothing doctors can do about it. They can treat the symptoms that come along with the diseases that AIDS caused, but it was mostly just about managing pain. There was no way they could beat AIDS. It was terminal. If you got it, you were going to die. But then in 1987, there was a breakthrough, or so it seemed. Azidothymidine, or more likely called zidovudine today, is an antiretroviral medication that is used to prevent and treat HIV/AIDS. It was also commonly called AZT, you've probably heard of it. AZT was originally developed in the 1960s by a US researcher as a cancer drug, supposed to insert itself into the DNA of a cancer cell and affect its ability to replicate and produce more cancer cells. But it simply didn't work as a cancer drug, and the drug was completely discarded. But then 2 decades later, HIV/AIDS emerges, and pharmaceutical companies desperately scramble to become the first to create a drug that would potentially help with the disease. They retest a whole load of old discarded drugs, just hoping that one will work, including a remade version of the original AZT. And it did seem to work and block the HIV virus's activity. Under a huge amount of pressure, the testing of AZT in AIDS patients is rushed. The usual tests overseen by the FDA would take years, but AZT was fast-tracked and given straight to patients. It was known to cause some side effects from the offset, including intestinal issues, immune damage, nausea, vomiting, and headaches. But hey, that's better than death by AIDS. This was a serious drug though. It was literally a form of chemotherapy, and so the side effects were horrendous. The most serious side effect was cell depletion of the bone marrow, which meant takers needed to have frequent blood transfusions. It was insane, but they were just desperate for something to work against HIV/AIDS. They launched a trial in which 300 AIDS sufferers are chosen to take part. The participants are randomly assigned AZT capsules or sugar pills for 6 months, and neither of them would know whether they had the actual drug or placebo. That was the idea anyway, they figured it out pretty quickly. After just 16 weeks, the trial ended. They had apparently strong enough evidence to suggest that AZT was working. The working group had only 1 death in the time that the placebo group had 19, and the company reasoned that it would be unethical to continue the trial and knowingly deprive the placebo group of life-saving treatment. So AZT is given to everyone. It really wasn't the best trial period in the world. The conditions weren't controlled among the patients, they were all receiving different treatments from their various doctors, and there was no way of knowing for sure that AZT was the thing making the difference. It could have been anything their doctors were using. Patients would also pool their pills, sharing them amongst each other to ensure that they'd all get at least some drugs. If you want a better understanding of this, actually, I'd really recommend watching Dallas Buyers Club. Matthew McConaughey in that film is incredible, and it takes a really interesting look into the trials, as well as the world of buyers clubs, which I'm not even going to attempt to touch in this video because I know it's already so long. But Dallas Buyers Club, I highly recommend it. Also, Rent. Rent is another really good thing to look at if you are interested in sort of how HIV affected actual people. Once the drug had been approved on March 19th, 1987, it goes on sale for $8,000 a year, which is more than $17,000 in today's money. It was the most expensive drug ever marketed. I can't fathom any life-saving drug costing anything, let alone that much money. I am eternally grateful to our NHS in the UK because that is just insanity. It was estimated that the drug company's gross profits for the next year would be $230 million. That's like literally putting a price on people's health. That could be a whole other video for me. It makes me really angry, but anyway. Considering that a huge amount of the AIDS sufferers in the USA were already marginalised group, the LGBTQ+ community, drug users, sex workers, people who were already ill, it wasn't exactly the most accessible drug. It led to a lot of black market buying, everyone desperate to get their hands on this so-called miracle drug. Only it wasn't a miracle at all. There was actually no evidence to suggest that it prolonged the life of AIDS patients, and it was found that the drug actually accelerated the very process that it was supposed to prevent, the loss of T cells. After a few months of prolonged use, it made people more ill than they were before, even though tests within the first few weeks showed improvements in T-cell levels. Turns out that the standard 400mg dosage every 4 hours was way too high. Eventually they did figure this out and dosages were changed, but the damage had kind of already been done. But AZT actually is still used today in combination with other antiretroviral drugs to treat HIV/AIDS. As the 90s come around, people become more educated on AIDS and the stigma slowly begins to fall away, although we know the stigma still exists today. The government puts more money into medical research and preventative measures are put into place. The word condom is actually used publicly and condom sales quadrupled in some areas. Safe sex is promoted rather than abstinence, which, as we all know, never works. Abstinence doesn't work. As more high-profile people die, people become more willing to listen. Freddie Mercury, Anthony Perkins, Liberace, Gia Carangi. The infection rate begins to slow, although there were still millions living with HIV worldwide and people were still dying from AIDS daily. The government put into action a load of legislation that directly affected HIV positive people. If you were HIV positive, you were legally prohibited from working in healthcare, donating blood, entering the country on a travel visa, or emigrating. If you've got HIV, obviously it makes sense that you shouldn't be allowed to donate blood, but the others are all just quite unnecessary. Educate people rather than just block them from society. I don't think I can stress enough in this video just how many people died during the AIDS crisis. If you were active in the gay community, you were one of the few lucky ones if you survived the 80s. It makes me laugh how often you hear or see older people on Facebook saying, oh, everyone nowadays is gay, in my day nobody was gay, but they were just either too scared to come out of the closet or they were dead or dying from AIDS. That's the horrible truth. Entire friendship groups, entire communities were just decimated from AIDS. People lost everyone. There are gay men who say they were going to a different funeral every single week for years on end. A funeral every single week. A bit of good news is that nowadays HIV is no longer the death sentence it once was. The CDC estimates that at the end of 2017 there were just over 1 million people diagnosed with HIV in the USA, although about 14% of infections are estimated to be undiagnosed. Worldwide, as of 2018, there's approximately 37.9 million people living with HIV/AIDS, with an estimated 1.7 million individuals becoming newly infected in 2018 alone. Approximately 79% of people living with HIV globally know of their positive status. That's 21%, 8.1 million people who are unaware and therefore more likely to spread it. It's still a big problem in Africa. By 2003, the AIDS crisis had taken off over there. 40% of Botswana's population was infected. The problem in Africa was similar to what was seen in America in the 80s. It was dubbed a gay disease, and leaders didn't want to acknowledge the existence of sex between men. And there was a lack of healthcare and education in poorer communities, which also led to the virus spreading rampantly. All in America, approximately 658,507 people have died from AIDS since 1981. People are still catching it, people are still getting diagnosed. In the UK, as of 2017, 93,385 people were living with HIV, with 4,453 people being diagnosed in 2018. Whilst we still don't have a cure for HIV, once you've got it, you've got it, the medical field has advanced so much it is now possible to have an undetectable viral load. Many people living with HIV can achieve undetectable status now by adhering to antiretroviral treatment over a period of at least 6 months. Medication can mean that the level of HIV virus in the body becomes so low that it's no longer infectious. As long as you continue to have your viral load monitored and it remains undetectable, there is zero risk of you being able to transmit HIV to others, and your health will be unaffected by HIV. Going on treatment doesn't automatically make you undetectable, and viral loads do fluctuate, so you need to keep getting tested. But if you're good with your medication and you look after yourself, you can generally be okay. Nowadays, a cocktail of drugs is used to act on all the different viral targets in something that is known as highly active antiretroviral therapy, HAART. Not everyone could possibly achieve undetectable status. It usually falls down to finding a treatment regime that works for each specific person. The medication is not a one-size-fits-all, but you can be detectable and still healthy. Evidence shows that somebody on medication now can lead a long and healthy life, your life expectancy the same as everyone else's, and the virus will never progress to full-blown AIDS. There are actually a couple of cases that show HIV completely cured, gone from the body. I think there's like 2 or 3 different stories I've read that says that somebody no longer has HIV, but that is definitely rarer, but it does show that medical science is getting there. But of course, even if you are undetectable, precautions should always be taken. Use condoms, always have safe sex. Girls, the pill only prevents pregnancy. It is no barrier against STIs. And get tested. If you are sexually active with multiple partners, you should be getting tested every 6 months. I can't speak for sexual health testing in the USA, I don't know how it works over there, but if you live in the UK and you're under 25 years old, you can pop to your nearest sexual health clinic for a free test. If you're too nervous to go and get tested, I get it, people are scary, you can order sexual health kits online with Superdrug, I know they do it. They will deliver it to your door, you do the test and you post it back to them and they will send you a text with your results. There are zero excuses, get tested. If you are a sexually active gay man or part of another high-risk group, PrEP is now available, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a daily medication that people take to reduce the risk of catching the virus if they're exposed to it. It stops the HIV virus from taking hold and spreading throughout your body, and it reduces the risk of getting HIV from sex by more than 90%. And the number is even higher, once combined with condoms. It only protects against HIV though, it's useless against all other STIs, so don't fall into that trap. If you're in the UK, PrEP is available on the NHS in Scotland, if you match the criteria for it. In Wales, it's available as part of the Prepared trial, which is running over 3 years. Health and Social Care in Northern Ireland have started offering PrEP through a pilot scheme, and in England, it's available for up to 26,000 people through the PrEP Impact trial. Although from what I can gather, I think this number has actually now been uncapped. Although it is frustrating that it's not available widely on the NHS as of yet, by making it a trial, it means that the NHS can buy the generic version of PrEP rather than the name brand Truvada, which is used in the USA. By using the generic brand, it brings the cost down, and the trial allows the NHS to understand how many people might need access to the drugs. As I understand, the trial is actually in its last year, and it's looking fairly likely that it's going to be approved for prescriptive use, but that could change. But if you are interested in taking part in the trial, it could be worth going to your local sexual health clinic to find out if they have any spaces left, or if not, you can buy it privately if you need to. I think I'm going to end this here. If you've stuck with this all the way through to the end, then I applaud you. This is probably one of the longest videos I've ever filmed, if not the longest. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Magellan TV. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, get tested, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.